Welcome to Echoes of Antiquity, the podcast where we explore the pivotal moments that shaped our world. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're diving into one of the most chaotic, transformative, and foundational periods in Western history, the 5th century. We're talking about the 400s, a time when empires crumbled, new powers rose from the ashes, and the very identity of Christianity was being forged in the fires of debate. To guide us through this turbulent century, we're honored to have with us Dr. Elias Davies, a renowned historian of late antiquity and early Christianity. Dr. Davies, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alex. The 5th century is truly a hinge point. It's impossible to understand the Middle Ages, the papacy, or even modern Christian theology without understanding the events that unfolded between the year 400 and 500. It's a century of crisis and creation, all at once.
Crisis and creation. I love that. So let's set the stage. As the century dawns, the Roman Empire is officially Christian, but it's also, it's in trouble, isn't it?
In deep trouble. The empire had already been split into eastern and western halves for administrative purposes. The east, centered on the magnificent new capital of Constantinople, was relatively stable and wealthy. The west, however, was hemorrhaging. Its economy was failing, its political leadership was often weak or corrupt, and its borders were under immense pressure from various Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, who were both migrating and raiding.
You mentioned the Goths, Vandals, and Franks. We often have this image of savage hordes sweeping in to destroy civilization. Is that accurate? And how did this pressure lead to the earth-shattering event of 410, the sack of Rome by the Visigoths?
That's a fantastic question because the reality is much more complex and interesting. The term barbarian is really just what the Romans called people who didn't speak Latin or Greek. Many of these groups weren't bent on destruction. They were often refugees or migrants looking for land and security. For decades, many had served within the Roman army as foederati or federates. They were allies, not just invaders. In fact, many were Christians themselves, though typically of the Arian variety, which was another theological controversy entirely. The crisis of the 5th century was often less about an outside invasion and more about the Roman state's inability to manage these complex relationships. The Visigoths who sacked Rome in 410, led by Alaric, hadn't set out to destroy the city. They were demanding payment and land they felt they were owed for their service. The sack was a result of a negotiation that went horribly wrong.
Wow. So how did the church respond to that accusation?
But regardless of the reasons, the psychological impact was catastrophic. Unthinkable. A Rome, the eternal city, hadn't been breached by a foreign enemy in 800 years. For traditional pagans, it was irrefutable proof that abandoning the old gods for this new Christian faith had doomed the empire. For Christians, it was a profound crisis of faith. How could God allow this to happen to his own Christian empire? It shook the foundations of their worldview.
So, what was the psychological impact of that breach? And the only way out is through God's grace.
Precisely. For Augustine, salvation is not a human achievement. It is a completely unearned gift from God, divine grace. This grace isn't just a helper. It's a necessity that precedes any human desire for good. This debate cemented the concepts of original sin and irresistible grace as cornerstones of Western Christianity, profoundly influencing everyone from medieval scholastics to the Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. The most powerful response came from a bishop in North Africa, a man who is arguably the single most influential Christian thinker after the Apostle Paul, Augustine of Hippo.
Of course. So his famous work, The City of God, is a direct reaction to the sack of Rome.
Precisely. Augustine spent over a decade writing it. He puts forward this radical idea. He says there are two cities, invisibly intertwined throughout history. The city of man, which is built on self-love and the pursuit of earthly glory. Empires like Rome fall into this category. And then there's the city of God, built on the love of God, whose citizens are the faithful. His point was that Rome, the city of man, was always destined to fall. Its fate was irrelevant to the ultimate triumph of the city of God. It was a brilliant reframing that gave Christians a way to make sense of the chaos and to detach the fate of their faith from the fate of any single empire.
Beyond his response to the crisis of the empire, Augustine was also fighting a major battle within the church itself, wasn't he? Against a thinker named Pelagius.
Absolutely, and this was arguably even more consequential for the future of Western theology. Pelagius was a British monk, an ascetic who was deeply concerned with moral laxity. He preached a message of radical human freedom. He argued that humans are born morally neutral, like Adam before the fall, and have the innate capacity to choose good or evil. Sin for him was a conscious act of free will, and humans could, through their own efforts, live a sinless life. Absolutely, and this was arguably even more consequential for the future of Western theology. Pelagius was a British monk, an ascetic who was deeply concerned with moral laxity. He preached a message of radical human freedom. He argued that humans are born morally neutral, like Adam before the fall, and have the innate capacity to choose good or evil. Sin for him was a conscious act of free will, and humans could, through their own efforts, live a sinless life.
That's a powerful concept. So while Augustine is providing this profound theological framework, what's happening on the ground? As the Western Empire continues to crumble, eventually leading to the last Western emperor being deposed in 476, who fills that power vacuum?
Increasingly, the church does. Bishops were often the only educated, organized, and respected authorities left in many cities. They organized food supplies, negotiated with barbarian warlords, and maintained some semblance of law and order. And nowhere was this more evident than in the city of Rome itself.
Which brings us to the rise of the papacy.
Exactly. With no emperor in the West, the Bishop of Rome's stature grew immensely. The great example from this century is Pope Leo I, or Leo the Great. He was a brilliant administrator and theologian. In 452, when Attila the Hun and his armies were marching on Rome, it wasn't an emperor or a general who rode out to meet him. It was Pope Leo, and somehow he persuaded Attila to turn back.
And that wasn't the only time he stepped into that role, was it? Just a few years later, in 455, Rome faced another threat from the sea.
Yes, from the Vandals, who had established a kingdom in North Africa and had become a major naval power. Their king, Gaiseric, arrived at the gates of Rome with an army. This time, there was no turning them back. The sack was inevitable. But once again, Pope Leo went out to meet the conqueror. He couldn't prevent the city from being plundered, but he did negotiate a crucial agreement. Gaiseric promised not to burn the city and not to massacre its inhabitants. The Vandals spent 2 weeks systematically looting Rome, but Leo's intervention almost certainly saved it from complete destruction. It's another powerful example of the Bishop of Rome filling the void left by the emperors, becoming the protector of the city.
An incredible story. Whether by divine intervention or just shrewd diplomacy, that act massively boosted the prestige of the papacy.
Absolutely. Leo was a key figure in asserting the primacy of the Roman See, based on the idea that the Pope was the direct successor to the Apostle Peter. He wasn't just a political figure, he was a theological heavyweight. And that's crucial, because while the West was dealing with political collapse, the wealthier, more stable East was consumed by a different kind of war, a war of ideas.
Right, these are the great Christological controversies. It sounds complicated, but what was the fundamental question they were trying to answer?
The question was this: who was Jesus Christ? The church had already agreed, at the Council of Nicaea in the previous century, that Jesus was fully divine. But how did that divinity relate to his obvious humanity? Was he a God who just looked like a man? Was he a man who was later adopted by God? Or was he somehow, incomprehensibly, both at the same time?
So you get these different schools of thought emerging.
Yes, two major centers of theology developed rival approaches. In Alexandria, in Egypt, Thinkers like Cyril of Alexandria emphasized Christ's divinity. They spoke of a union of God and man, and their fear was that if you separated the two too much, you would diminish Christ's power to save us. Their watchword was one nature, a single divine human nature after the incarnation.
Okay, so that's the Alexandrian view. What was the alternative?
The alternative was centered in Antioch, in Syria. Thinkers there, like Nestorius, were deeply concerned with protecting Christ's genuine humanity. They insisted on a clear distinction between the divine and the human in Christ. They argued that if you blended them together, as they thought the Alexandrians did, you'd end up with a strange third thing that was neither truly God nor truly man. So they emphasized two distinct natures, divine and human, joined together in one person.
It sounds like they were both trying to safeguard something important, just from different angles.
That's the tragedy of it. But these weren't polite academic debates. Bishops were excommunicating each other, riots broke out, and the emperors were constantly intervening, trying to force a resolution. This whole conflict boiled over when Nestorius, who was from the Antiochene school, became the Archbishop of Constantinople.
And what did he do that was so controversial?
He objected to calling the Virgin Mary Theotokos, which means God-bearer or Mother of God. For him, this sounded like Mary. A human creature gave birth to God the Creator, which was absurd. He preferred Christotokos, or Christ-bearer. But for his opponents, especially Cyril of Alexandria, this was tantamount to splitting Jesus into two separate beings, a man named Jesus and the divine word dwelling inside him. It seemed to deny the very core of the incarnation.
So this all has to be settled, which leads us to the biggest event of the century, the Council of Chalcedon in 451.
Indeed, hundreds of bishops, primarily from the East, gathered at Chalcedon near Constantinople. The goal was to finally put this issue to rest. A key document presented was a letter from Pope Leo the Great in Rome, his famous Tome. It was a masterpiece of Latin theology that clearly articulated the Western understanding, that Christ possessed two full natures, one divine and one human, perfectly united in a single person.
And was that accepted?
By the majority, yes. Legend has it that when Leo's tome was read out, the bishops shouted, "Peter has spoken through Leo." The council produced the Chalcedonian definition, which became the cornerstone of Orthodox Christology for Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestants to this day. It states that Jesus Christ is one person subsisting in two natures, divine and human, and these natures are united unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably.
It sounds like a careful balancing act, trying to include the valid concerns of both the Alexandrian and Antiochene schools.
It was. It used Alexandrian language of one person and Antiochene language of two natures. But here's the crucial outcome. It didn't unite everyone. For a huge portion of the Christians in the East, particularly in Egypt and Syria, the two natures language sounded far too close to the condemned teachings of Nestorius. They felt Chalcedon had betrayed the faith.
And this leads to the first major lasting schism in the church.
Yes, the churches that rejected Chalcedon are what we today call the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, and others. They held to the one nature, or miaphysis formula of Cyril of Alexandria. So while Chalcedon defined orthodoxy for the majority, it did so at the cost of unity. The theological map of Christianity was permanently redrawn in 451.
So while the Eastern Church is fracturing over these incredibly complex theological definitions, what's the final major development in the West as the century closes? The political map is now a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. How is the Church engaging with them?
This is the critical story that sets the stage for the Middle Ages. Most of the Germanic tribes that took over parts of the Western Empire, the Goths, the Vandals, were Arian Christians. They didn't accept the divinity of Christ as defined at Nicaea and Chalcedon. This created a religious barrier between them and their Roman or Romano-Gallic subjects who were Nicene Christians. But then, right at the end of the century, something decisive happens.
So, Dr. Davies, as we look back on this incredibly dense and dramatic century, what would you say is its ultimate legacy for Christianity?
I would say the 5th century is where the distinct characters of Western and Eastern Christianity truly solidified. In the West, facing political collapse, the Church became a powerful, centralized institution with the Pope as its administrative and spiritual head, a model that would define medieval Europe. Its main challenge was survival and converting the new Germanic kingdoms.
And in the East?
In the East, where the empire survived, the Church remained closely intertwined with imperial power, and its intellectual life was focused on defining the deepest mysteries of faith through these great ecumenical councils. The century that began with the shock of a falling Rome ended with a Christian world that was intellectually defined by Augustine, politically structured around a powerful papacy, and theologically divided by the definitions of Chalcedon. The foundations for the next 1,000 years were well and truly laid.
An age of collapse that gave birth to the medieval world. Dr. Elias Davies, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for shedding light on this crucial century.
The pleasure was all mine, Alex.
That's all the time we have for today on Echoes of Antiquity. Join us next time as we continue to uncover the stories that built our past.